Okay, I want to continue our discussion of carboxylic acid derivatives now by transitioning specifically into reactions where we discuss the acidity and electrophilicity of carboxylic acids first, and then we'll move on to their derivatives. So carboxylic acids have two main characteristics in their reactivity. And we can first explain this phenomenon by showing some resonance delocalization. The second most important resonance contributor is produced by donating a lone pair from the singly bound oxygen into the carbonyl, developing a pi bond there, and pushing an extra lone pair onto the carbonyl oxygen. And this separates charge. Of course, we call this the Zwitter ion, where they cancel out no net charge. However, it's still a full octet resonance form, which means it's quite stable and important as long as this CO pi overlap is good. You could show one more resonance form by simply pushing the pi pair back to the singly bound oxygen in the form of a lone pair. So I'll add all of the implicit lone pairs here.